Good morning. My name is Kay Kopecky, and I am the owner of the house that sat on the corner of Chicago Avenue and Bothwell. It was called the Harmening House. It was also called the Tees General Store, and then it was, and we're going to go through that move with you folks today. It's a beautiful sunny day, and we are so excited that the Historical Society has asked us to do this promotion. This house, which was at 35 West Chicago Avenue, now known as Palatine Rd. The neighbors to my right was Tharp Mortuary, and they were there for a long time, and after they moved and sold, it became the Pool Mortuary. And the neighbor to the back of me, artistic cuisine, was our flower shop, Nelson's Bouquet, B-O-K-A-Y for Bob and Kay, and we were there 25 years. We'll talk more about that as we go along. The house sat right here on this corner. It was 12 inches on the east side of the sidewalk. It was all the medium that was left between the sidewalk and the house. And it was also 18 inches lower on the 18 inches on that side. It had shifted over the years, and so people would walk by and be able to look right into the windows because of that. Behind the house was a barn, a wood-framed barn, and Mrs. Schutte, Emily Schutte, who I got to meet and who lived at Lutheran Home for the Aged in Arlington Heights, would come here as a child and spend the summers with her grandmother. And she drew me a drawing of the house and the barn. It had a wooden sidewalk that went around the side of the house, and it had a well, and she shows herself pumping water from the well. The Mankenbergs, who we bought the house from, bought this house in 1949. That was the same year again that the A&P was just getting started. In 1957, they purchased the lot at 216 West Wilson Street in Palatine. There was a lawsuit over the property here. The Mankenbergs wanted to move it down on South Bothwell. And because of the sizes of the house and this house being so large, there was a lot of commotion about it, a petition signed and so forth and so on. And finally they gave up and bought the lot up on Wilson. They purchased that lot in 1957. The house was moved on April 8th, 1958. Haemker and Son were house movers in Palatine, and Charles Mankenberg contacted Will Haemker, and he set up the move. He also set up all the people that had to be included in the move, and so that is where they started, with Will Haemker and his Haemker and Sons Moving and Engineering Company. And they were here in Palatine, and they moved a lot of houses in Palatine. It was here first, and it was plaqued Dr. Charles Mankenberg, optometrist. Margaret worked in the city, and on April 3rd, as she was coming home on her birthday, the house had started its move. And it had moved from this exact point that we're at to Broadway. That was the first move. The first move was supposed to be to go to Greeley, and I have a map of that original move. However, because there were less trees, and it happened to be on a Wednesday, and in Palatine on Wednesdays, all the businesses closed. So they had less traffic in town. The move was not quite as it was a little easier to get past that Brockway place, and they were able to take it then the second day as up to Shoppy Store, which would be Slade and Brockway. And there it sat overnight as well. But when Margaret got off the train that night from Chicago, she saw the house standing at Brockway and it happened to be her birthday, which was quite a thing. And they left the children out of school so they could watch the move. It was quite the thing to see happen. This huge house coming down Chicago Avenue, making the turn onto Brockway, eventually making the turn onto Slade to go to Wilson, and then Wilson to Smith, and then back into Comfort Lumber's lot where they left the house sit for a few days. We purchased the house in 1966. It was already, of course, moved to Wilson Street. Robert and Jeanette Nelson had lived in the upstairs apartment, and Jeanette and Robert owned the flower shop on the absolute other corner, and it was called Nelson's Flowers. I want to backtrack just a little bit and tell you of the cost of moving this big house. Will Haemker was in charge for the Haemker company, and they got the other workmen to dig out the evergreens and so forth and get ready for this move. The actual cost of moving this house from this location to Wilson Street was $2,000, which at the time might have seemed like a lot of money, but today doesn't sound like much at all. Actually, the cost of taking the house for a ride was trivial compared to what the other services needed to have for expenses. Like the foundation and the cement floor for the basement was $2,300, and the 5 to 6 rows of cement blocks for the above the foundation were $790, and about $1,000 for the walk, the stoops, and the garage floor. $600 was disconnect and reconnect the furnace, another $600 to disconnect and reconnect the water and the sewer. As I said before, Haemker's charged $2,000 for the move. The village allowed the permit, and the plans had been slightly altered because of it being on a Wednesday and not wanting to go up to Greeley. They went up to Brockway. Illinois Bell needed $735, and about $400 was needed to pre-trim the trees along the route at $14 an hour. Also, Public Service asked for $300 for hookup and so forth. Probably one of the more interesting things to the children was the fact that the trees had been pre-trimmed prior to this move. However, the day of the move, there were 2 or 3 men on top of the house. And if you see the house or come by the house, you will see how tall it is. They pre-trim some more tree limbs if they needed to, and to lift the wires so that the house could glide along the street. As I said before, the home was built in 1865, and unfortunately, neither myself nor Margaret or Charles could tell us anything prior to when they bought it and did the moving. It was at the southwest corner again of Bothwell and Palatine Rd. The old photographs show that it had a full front porch, not a fancy front porch. It was just a step-up porch because it was like a general store. They did not have anything. It was just a plank floor on front, a couple steps to get into the porch and then into the store. However, Margaret and Charles were really saved all the gingerbread after they bought it. And Mr. Wittenberg, who was recommended to them, he was from Chicago, came and did all the remodeling inside and outside of the house. And they took all that gingerbread and reused it because the house was, the door was in the middle. There was a bedroom to the right as you look at the house today. And there was a parlor on the left. And there was a window in each of those side rooms. The door that is on the house today and the door frame are the original from when it was remodeled. The gingerbread was all made here in Palatine at the Batterman Mill. And the Batterman Mill was at Smith and Wilson, just east of where the house sits today. It used to be Arlington Plating. And Arlington Plating moved to Arlington Heights, and now it's just a parking lot with the bank building across the street. And the train station then is ahead of that. Mr. Fred Harmening was an early owner. And then Fred W Thies, Thies, had a general store on the first floor. And to my knowledge, they lived above the store. The first floor, and by 1910, it was no longer used as a store. He passed away. His wife carried on for a while in the store. And then when she passed, they broke up the business, and it was no longer a store. At one time, Dr. Frances Merkler, Mergler, our first woman doctor in Palatine, had offices on the second floor, as well as Mrs. Lampman, who was a midwife. And many people used to tell me when we first moved in the house that they were either born in the house or she went to their house to have the birth. She was a highly respected midwife, and I would imagine that she worked with Dr. Frances Merkler at all times. As I said before, we bought the house in 1966. We moved in and we painted and decorated and so forth and so on. And kind of made a sow's ear into a plowshare and did a lot of things, which you will see in a later video of the house. As I said before, we raised our two boys there. Bob started working on the garden at once, along with everything else and running a business. So we will always have the distinction of moving in there as bride and groom. The buildings behind me were also owned by the Mankenbergs. Charles Mankenberg and Margaret made $37,000 on this lot alone. And on the frontage here, on Chicago Avenue, there were like 3 other houses, perhaps 4, that all faced Chicago Avenue. And so when Charles got the money for the $37,000 for the lot here on the corner, they had also owned the buildings behind us, and Harrington Manor was already there. And that's why it is called 16 South Bothwell, where Argentine cuisine restaurant is. There was a house there, and they tore the house down, and that house address was 16 South Bothwell. So the whole little strip mall there became 16 South Bothwell. Margaret Charles put the 2 agendas to the building, where our flower shop was, Nelson's Bouquet, and where Anne's Unique Boutique was. And then there was also a beauty shop there at one time. And I think we'll go into more of that in a later video. The day of the move, they had the house all with huge planks underneath it and so forth and so on, as movers do. And they pulled the house kind of kitty-wonkus across Chicago Avenue. And as they were pulling the house off of its foundation here, the front of the house went up a bit. And so Jeanette and Robert Nelson was for sure that with that rise as it lifted up, that everything was going to shift to the back of the house because of that rise. However, nothing moved. They had a TV set between the upstairs front windows on one of those metal stands that you had in the 60s, and it never moved. She was sure it had gone all the way to the kitchen, but it had not moved. She had decorative bottles with water in them. She had a fish in a fish tank. Nothing was moved or destroyed in any way, shape, or form. Dr. Meek, who had an office also in this general area, he was a dentist, and he would come out of his office every 10 minutes or so and take a video of the house being moved up the street. Look at the sky today, how gorgeous it is. Oh. Are we ready? The big building in the center, which is now Harrington Manor, was originally, when we were here, the east side of the building was Dr. Sarakowski. He was a podiatrist, and he had his office on the east side, on the bottom of the building. On the west side was Mr. Berlin. He was an insurance man, and he had his office in the back part on the west side. And the front part of the building, I can't tell you right now who was in the front part. But anyway, there were three people that had offices in that building. And the main room in the center of the building was the waiting room for everybody. Then we went up to Anne's Unique Boutique, and the floor part of that east side of that building at one time was a beauty shop. And then Anne's Unique Boutique building, Don Hager, who owned this at one time for a short period of time, he was a realtor, and he was in the front of Anne's Unique Boutique. And before him was a deli. It was owned by, and I can only give you her first name, Florence. And her daughter ran the deli in the front part of Anne's Unique Boutique building, and they lived in the back of the building. And they ran the deli from the front. And then we had the liquor store. The liquor store now has just changed hands, but it was Dobby's Worldwide Liquor, and Dobby was the owner. And then his son took over for a little while after he passed away. And then if we go around the corner from Dobby, we have the post office. And the post office is right there adjoining the liquor store, but facing west. I think it was a real mistake when they moved the post office out to Colfax. I realized that they needed more space, but we really needed a postal place in town. So one of our last owners of the building was Harold Leposki. Leposki's had a general store, dry goods store in Barrington, and Harold bought the building and was a wonderful owner of the building. As far as getting back to the parking lot and Chicago Avenue, at one time there was, I believe, 3 or 4 houses that they all were sold to make this parking lot, because this was going to become the downtown area, and they needed parking, which to this day they still need more parking. But that is why that this was all taken. All these houses were taken down or moved so that they could build the parking lot. And like I said before, Charles got $37,000 for his part of the parking lot. Now, when we moved up to Wilson Street, and Margaret and Charles had decided to move to Florida, we said the house was sold. We didn't even discuss the price or anything. And we rode up to Alan Peters' office in Arlington Heights and signed the papers, and it was ours. And we paid $25,500 for it. Another little trivia thing is that where the house sits now, they used to call it Trouble Hill. Trouble Hill was over a lawsuit on a house that was up there on top of the hill. And we are on the very top of the hill. So that, and I do have the case number, but I've never looked up the case number of why exactly it was called Trouble Hill. But we've tried to discourage that name over the years. We opened Nelson's Bouquet in the 70s, and we're here 25 years when we lost it to a fire. And so we decided then that it was time to take a good thing and not have somebody buy it and wreck it. It was a show place, even if I have to say so myself. People came, they loved the window displays. Christmas time, we always had a Christmas open house the first Sunday in November, and the whole town was invited to come and see all the new trends and so forth. Bob and I would go to New York to do buying trips, and we'd also use the Chicago market, but for something different and unusual, we tried to go to New York or Atlanta or one of those places. And we had a wonderful staff of caring people who we were a little bit above, past the goal of just a regular flower shop. And that's, of course, when every grocery store didn't have flowers. And we were very specific on weddings and funerals that we carried on the next day and made sure everything was perfect. It was a whole different era of flower business than it is today. Bob and I also used to travel around the country for several companies. We traveled for Guard Industry, which was a paint company. We traveled and did shows for other florists in Florida and Omaha and various places around the country. And all of that added to what I considered good business. And one of the things that I think is so important today that we miss is the PR that we give people. We never, ever said to anybody, you have to buy something. We had a bench out in front of the big window. And when I'd see the little old ladies come from the Jewel, I'd say, come in. You don't have to buy anything today. We just want you to come in and enjoy the prettiness of this place. And they would be so tickled to do that. And our two boys were not too involved, but if they wanted something special, they had to either do containers, tape containers, glue containers, so that they could get a few dimes for their work. So they became a part of it too. They often said, I don't think we'll carry on what you were doing, even if we wouldn't have had the fire, because Mom and Dad, you worked so hard, and it took so long to get your business to where you wanted it, and so forth and so on. So anyway, it was a wonderful experience for 25 years. Wouldn't trade it in for anything in the world. And we would just have loved to have gone on, but the fire was a sign from someone that we should call it quits while we had the opportunity and that we had a good business that people still talk about today. At this area and behind me was a bookstore. It was run by Art Zerkowski. And it was not a bookstore that children were allowed into. It was, he was arrested several times that we saw for booking. He was a bookie. And it would just go for so long, and then they'd come and take him away again, and then he'd come right back and be back in business. And some of the materials were very adult-oriented. As I said, it was not a place for children. The last tenants who owned this strip mall was Peter Hammond. They resided in Inverness, and he's since passed. But they had a wonderful clothing store, men and women's clothing store, and it was called Peter Daniels. Peter Daniels has now since moved to Barrington, and they have a lovely boutique there as well. But he was the last owner under the flower shop and so forth of this building, the main building. They were in the main building. Peter Daniels. This area is where our flower shop was for almost 25 years. It's right behind me here. It was called Nelson's Bouquet, B-O-K-A-Y. And the Nelson part came from Robert Jeanette Nelson owning Nelson's Flowers, and never having been incorporated, we could take their name and add ours to it. Bob had his education at the University of Illinois and had his degree in horticulture, ornamental horticulture, and was a wonderful teacher to his employees that we had over the years. He was very strict on care and handling and all of the things that go with our industry that people don't even think about, but know that during care and handling, which is the most important part, we had a wonderful, wonderful group of people who are customers, and really customers were more than customers, they were our friends. And to this day, we still think of them as our friends. Weddings and everything were always taken to the church and waited on by he or I, and service was of the utmost importance. He was a wonderful designer, and he taught his design staff all the good things that go with the industry. He also traveled, as I did, around the country, doing shows for other florists, and that was a great teacher as well, because we learned from each other. And to this day, I still keep myself involved, and I know if he was here, he would be involved as well. And I thank you for the afternoon with me.